But first, I always like to give a short introduction to just what are we talking about when we say Catholic social teaching? What is the body of teaching? Where can you go find it? If you're like me, talks are great, but I want to go hear it for myself. I want to go find out for myself. And so I want you to know what documents are we talking about, where can you go? So there's one handout here, Catholic Social Teaching Resources. And that first paragraph there, you can just read on your own. This is kind of my standard handout. Whenever anyone emails me and says, do you know a good book, I just send them this. And so the first paragraph is really just a warning about reading secondary literature on Catholic social teaching. Because people who write about it tend to come from a political or economic angle. And so they already are committed to a certain political or economic system, and then they read Catholic social teaching to see how it stacks up to what they already think is the best political economic system, rather than reading it sort of with an open heart saying, well, what does the church have to say? And so secondary literature, you're always sort of filtering through somebody else's political or economic views. So I like to encourage people to go to the encyclicals. And there you have a list of what would fall under the canon of modern Catholic social teaching. My dissertation director always corrected me every time I said Catholic social teaching. She'd say, you have to say modern Catholic social teaching. Because it's not like we just invented Catholic social teaching in 1891, right? If it is Catholic, then Jesus invented it, because we don't make up new stuff, right? So modern Catholic social teaching. So just to give you a little historical context, a lot of things changed in the 19th century, politically and economically. And from the church's perspective, one of the biggest things to change was the rise of secular government. And with the rise of secular government in the 19th century came a push against the social action of the church, because the state wanted to do that stuff itself. So pushing the church out of education, pushing the church out of marriage. The state will marry people, will license people's marriages. Pushing the state out of taking care of the poor. The state will take care of the poor. The church doesn't need to do it anymore. Pushing the church out of hospitals. All of these areas that up until then, primarily the church was the leader in. With the rise of secular government, they tried to push the church out. In fact, many of the secular governments in the 19th century would outlaw or exile religious orders. Because, well, one, of course, they wanted their property, but two, they wanted to take over the role that the religious orders were fulfilling. And so the Germans would exile all the Benedictines, and the French would exile all the Franciscans. And you read the history, and I always think, well, where did they all go? Because every Western European country was exiling them. Where did they all end up? So that was a big shift for the social action of the church. At the same time, you have the blossoming of liberal capitalism, which was relatively new, right? You had a mercantilist controlled economy up until, Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, which we'll talk a little bit about. And so the economy was shifting at the same time as industrialization was exploding. So you have a shift in the way the economy is being run, the way production and trade is being handled, at the same time as you have this flight from the country to the cities to work in the factories. And you have people working for wages at a level that you wouldn't have even been able to predict prior to that. Right? Thomas Aquinas, you study Thomas Aquinas on private property, he says almost nothing about remunerative wages because it was a very rare thing. The economy just didn't function that way. Right? You ran your shoe shop and sold shoes and got money from the shoes you made. Very rare was the situation where someone was working for a wage. So all of these different things are going on and shifting the political and economic landscape. And then, of course, we have, if you have a picture of the 19th century in your head, mass urban poverty, which was a relatively new phenomenon too, right? I always say, if you're not a historian, and you're having trouble situating the 19th century, just imagine any Charles Dickens book you've ever read and just put that picture in your head, right? Get Oliver Twist in your head and you're in the right area. So while all this is going on and while these great social questions are being discussed, the first person to give the answer that got people's attention was Karl Marx. And Karl Marx comes along and critiques the system as it is and gives a rather accurate critique. If you read Catholic social teaching, the Church's critique is not that dissimilar to the critique of Karl Marx. The problem is that his solution to the problem was worse than the problem that he was trying to correct. Right? But now he's gaining a lot of traction. And so in the Catholic Church, in Western Europe, this is sort of a Western European focus right now, saying, you know, what are we called to do about this? We're looking at this mass poverty. We're looking at the unjust structuring of our society. Right? There are all sorts of unjust laws at the time. Right? Workers couldn't organize. If they organized, they were arrested and thrown in prison. But the owners could organize, and they would get together all the time and band together to keep wages as low as they possibly could. Right? Don't give your guys a raise because I don't want to give my guys a raise. There are all these different inequities that were in the legal system and part of common economic practice. And so Christians, wanting to follow the gospel in every aspect of their life, are asking, well, what are we called to do about this? What is the answer to all these questions? So in 1891, you see the first encyclical on that list. Leo XIII publishes Rerum Novarum and addresses all of these questions. Critiques the system as it is, rejects socialism, and then offers some positive, constructive solutions and some principles for people to follow in order to build a more just and more humane society. And this document reverberated around the world in Catholic and non-Catholic circles. It had a huge impact. Leo XIII was kind of like Pope Francis. People were really paying attention to him. Catholic and non-Catholic alike. In fact, similar to Pope Francis, everyone was freaking out that he was way too liberal. Right? And they're like, oh no, and you put electricity in the Vatican and everyone went, oh, he's too hard. And he said, the other thing he did that freaked everybody out was he said, no, it's okay, priests can ride bikes. So everyone was afraid that this modern Pope was going to bring the church down and they're freaking out. But he was a charismatic man of his time, so people were paying attention to him. And everybody was reading and discussing Rerum Novarum. Now in Catholic circles, it's been called the Magna Carta of Catholic social teaching. And if you look at the encyclicals that follow Rerum Novarum, you'll notice that a lot of them end with the number 1. Right? And that's not by accident. It is because subsequent popes have written encyclicals on the anniversary of Rerum Novarum to commemorate that document. And to take the timeless principles that Leo XIII laid down, but then apply them to whatever the modern, current issues were. Right? The issues of 1981 are very different than the issues of 1891. But John Paul II takes the same principles and says, okay, what did they mean in the middle of the Cold War? What do they mean in 1991 when the wall has come down and we're dealing with the breakdown of the bloc struggle? If you are a historian and you're a fan of history, it is a very fun exercise to read these documents straight through, because you can see the course of 100 years of history sort of playing out in the subtext of what they talk about. You will notice though too, I will point this out briefly, Paul VI in 1967 wrote Populorum Progressio. And that encyclical addresses social questions but from a different angle. So Leo XIII comes at it from a very political, economic, let's look at systems and structures. What kind of society do we want to build for the sake of the human person, as we know the human person to be? But Populorum Progressio begins with the human person. It says, who is this human person and who are we called to be in society? talking more about the call to solidarity and our obligation as Christians to commit ourselves to the common good. And that encyclical was so important that you'll see in 1987, John Paul II commemorated that one. Solicitudo Rei Socialis, one of my favorites on that list. And then Caritas in Veritate 2009 actually is also commemorating Populorum Progressio. It just was published a little late. He apologizes for it somewhere in the letter. I can't remember what was going on. I always point that out because that happened a year after I finished my dissertation. And while I was writing my dissertation, I kept predicting he's going to commemorate. I know that Benedict is going to commemorate Populorum Progressio in 2007. I don't want him to because I'll have to read it then and I'll have to put it in my dissertation. And I just know he's going to. And then 2007 came and went and he didn't. Okay, I predicted wrong. But then in 2009 he commemorated it. And in there he's like, I'm sorry this is late. I was like, that's okay. It worked out really well for us. So I recommend going to these encyclicals if you really want to get to the bottom of what the church has to say about our responsibilities as Catholics in building up the just society and committing ourselves to the common good. But I'm not going to talk as much, so sometimes I give here is why you should commit yourself to the common good introduction to Catholic social teaching, right? You were made to be perfected in self-gift. And so you are called to lay down your life for your neighbor. You are called to consider the good of your brothers and sisters, not just your own self-interest. You are called to cultivate the virtue of solidarity. All of these things that we need to do to live out the gospel in the world, right? Because it's not good enough for me to just say, well, I'm a just person and I don't oppress people and I'll just sit in my living room and feel good about how just and non-oppressive I am, right? If I'm following Christ, I'm going to go out and try to help others who are being oppressed or who are the victims of injustice. But I just gave that talk last week, so I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to give the more political talk, which is another important aspect of it. Because last week I gave the self-gift solidarity talk. And then everyone was like, well, what about politics? What about politics? What is a just government? So I thought, okay, tonight I will answer the question that they all wanted to hear the answer. And if you want really, I mean, Rerum Novarum is interesting. Rerum Novarum, of course, is to be recommended as one of the shorter of these social encyclicals. I don't know about you all, but I have not read Laudato Si yet, simply because when I hit print preview, it says 145 pages. Anyway. But everything is in there. All of these other encyclicals, and I have read them and read them and read them, right? This is my dissertation work, so you know what that's like, right? I've read them over and over again, and none of them say anything that I can't find in Rerum Novarum in German. Laborem Exercens, 1981, is focused on human work, and it's basically like a 90-page reflection on 2 paragraphs of Rerum Novarum, right? And John Paul II just like opened up the suitcase and let all that stuff come out. But in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII is critiquing liberal capitalism as it existed in his time, and rejecting outright socialism, Marxist socialism. Now that's an important distinction to keep in mind, that liberal capitalism is critiqued, but is seen as redeemable, given certain other principles added to it. But socialism is considered fundamentally flawed. And what is fascinating to me about this, if you have studied the social contract, is that both of these systems, which seem very much opposed to each other, opposite of each other. If you know, like me, I lived through the Cold War. It was like black and white. It was like the white, and this is going to be a dated reference too, so never mind. I was thinking of Mad Magazine, the Spy versus Spy, if anyone knows that. Right? Completely diametrically opposed forces, but ultimately coming from the same source, which is the social contract theory that preceded them in the 18th century. Now there's one passage from Rousseau's The Social Contract that is sort of helpful for framing the question, so I would like to look at that first together. Now Irina said about 30 minutes, and I'll be honest, I can't tell you what time it is in under 30 minutes, so it might go a little bit over 30 minutes. So this is the opening of the social contract. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question I think I can answer. If I took into account only force and the effects derived from it, I should say, as long as a people is compelled to obey and obeys, it does well. As soon as it can shake off the yoke and shakes it off, it does still better. For regaining its liberty by the same right as took it away, either it is justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for those who took it away. But the social order is a sacred right, which is the basis of all other rights. Nevertheless, this right does not come from nature, and must therefore be founded on conventions. Before coming to that, I have to prove what I have just asserted. And I keep that line because I always think, yes, you do. I don't buy any of that. But you see these two claims put in bold, right? The first one, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. It's a great line. But the presumption of the social contract theorists was that in nature, we are completely at liberty. We can do whatever we want. As long as we have the power to accomplish it, we are free to do it. There's no restraint of relationship, there's no restraint of moral obligation. If you want it in the state of nature, you grab it. The law of the jungle is the state of nature. But then people find out that if they band together, they can get more stuff, basically. And so they give certain things up. They give up their liberty in order to enter in society and receive the benefits of society. So then the rules of society are considered chains because they're restricting this nature that you have, which is to just aggress and get whatever you want, right, with total liberty. So then he says the social order is a sacred right and it is the basis of all other rights. Because prior to entering into society, prior to the social order, there are no rights. If I want to hit you over the head and take your beer, I'm going to do it, right? Unless somebody bigger than me tries to stop me, or meaner than me, or thirstier than me. It's only when we come into society and go, okay, I won't hit you over the head and take your beer, you won't ever hit me over the head and take my beer, do you agree? And yes, I agree, and we sign the, proverbial contract. Now we have rights, because we've made that agreement. And so the rights of the human person, as you see, do not come from nature. They're founded on conventions, right? Just agreements that we all make when we enter in society with each other. Okay? So now we get kind of two systems. I'm going to use this whiteboard just to sort of frame this. We get two systems. So Leo XIII is critiquing what we'll call liberal capitalism. I'm using it very generally, so don't say, okay, liberal capitalism is really this other thing. And Marxist socialism, rejecting that outright. And what the liberal capitalists don't go all the way down this road, because most of them come out of a natural rights tradition. Because the liberal philosophers of the 18th century, their big fight was, let's get rid of the king. And the king doesn't have any more rights than I do because we're all born with them by nature. Human nature comes with its rights. But they really cottoned on to this man is born free and everywhere he is in chains thing. So that their goal for society was to increase as much as possible this original liberty that is lost when you sign the social contract. And so social responsibility, I'm going to shorthand that, is a kind of slavery, it's a kind of chain. They accept that state of total liberty that is diminished by entering into association with other people. But then what Marx accepted and what the socialists accepted is this idea that the state confers rights. The state confers rights. And so, you know, private property, you don't have a right to that, except that we say you do. And if we say you don't, we the state, then you don't. Kind of like the right to life in our country, which we might talk about a little bit. We've decided you don't have that right, unborn people, so we're just going to not protect you in that right. We'll protect these people, but not you. Because we're in charge, right? Rights are a convention. So we come up then, we end up then, at the end of the 19th century with these two seemingly conflicting, you know, they both basically start out as economic systems that then create political systems to support the economic system. Pius XI in 31, writing on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, called these the twin rocks of shipwreck. We must avoid the twin rocks of shipwreck. He says, the twin rocks of shipwreck must be carefully avoided. For as one is wrecked upon or comes close to what is known as individualism, by denying or minimizing the social and public character of the right of property, right? In 31, property was still the biggest issue. So by rejecting or minimizing the private and individual character of this same right, one inevitably runs into collectivism, or at least closely approaches its tenets. So these are the two errors associated with these two systems. Individualism, again, he's talking about private property, but you could apply it to many different things, right? Individualism, which keeps me from accepting my social responsibility, my social obligations, or collectivism, which totally destroys the individual and individual rights. If you're interested in the rejection of collectivism, of course, read John Paul II, who lived in a country that went from being fascist to being socialist, and he has a very good sense of what is wrong with the collectivist system. This political and economic division is somewhat breaking down in our time, of course, because all of the countries that accepted communist socialism are increasingly becoming capitalist, right? Even China, which still typically, I mean, on paper is socialist, is embracing a sort of state capitalism. But you're going to see when we get to the end that this is still two different errors present in society. Perhaps our own society has areas of one and areas of the other. And both need to be rejected by us who want to build a just society. So now I'll begin with socialism. Why do we reject socialism? Well, there are all sorts of normal historical factors for rejecting Marxist socialism, right? You know, it's atheist for one thing, so that's not good. They set out to destroy the family. Marx, in fact, if you read the Communist Manifesto closely, if you get past the brilliant rhetoric, even I read it and it's like, man, that rhetoric is just brilliant. When you get past that, you can see that the goal was to eliminate any subgroup. So the only group that existed was the state and this lone individual. So get rid of marriage, get rid of family, get rid of national ties, get rid of workers' unions, get rid of all these smaller groups in society so that there's nothing but the state and the one person. Their endorsement of class conflict as the inevitable course of history. The church has a lot to say about how that's not the way to build a just society as well, because we see humanity as a family, not as forces in perpetual conflict with each other. But what I want to focus on is the fundamental problem here that the state does not confer rights, that rights are natural and they're not given to us by the state. Now, in the documentary history, you'll see it begins with private property. That was the big issue. Do we have a right to private property, or has Marx got it all right? No, he doesn't. Right? We come by these rights naturally. Even in our country, as I mentioned, we have this problem with human life today. The government saying that they can decide who deserves to be protected in the right to life and who they are not going to protect in their right to life, who in fact they may fund the killing of. So there's a quote, another quote here I'd like to look at from Pope Benedict, a book called Christianity and the Crisis of Culture. A brilliant book if you're interested in these things. It's a series of short essays. It might be a little bit more approachable than an encyclical, and Pope Benedict, of course, is one of the most linear writing popes we've had. He's so easy to read because it's just like, if A, then B, then C, I can do D. Unlike John Paul II, who's just in the circular, A, then B, then C, and then A again, and how about a little more B and E, right? You gotta be a little more fluid to follow this logic. So in Christianity and the Crisis of Culture, he's writing, in this section, he writes a whole essay against abortion from a purely, I would say purely, natural law perspective, without invoking any sort of religious or theological principles. It's almost a political argument. In fact, well, you'll see what he says here. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed by almost all the countries of the world in 1948 in the aftermath of the terrible ordeal of the Second World War, expresses fully, even in its title, the awareness that human rights, the most fundamental of which is, of course, the right to life itself, belong to man by nature, that the state recognizes them but does not, in fact, confer them, and that they are applicable to all men as such, not because of other secondary characteristics of particular individuals, which others would be entitled to define at their pleasure. It follows that a state that claims the prerogative of defining who is and who is not the subject of rights, and that consequently accepts that some persons have the right to violate the fundamental right to life of other persons, contradicts the democratic ideal, although it continues to appeal to this claim. Such a state imperils the very basis on which it governs, for when it accepts that the rights of the weakest may be violated, it also accepts that the law of the jungle prevails over the rule of law. Now that harkens back again to that social contract theory view, that out in nature it is the rule of the jungle, and it's only when you enter into society that you get the benefits of the rule of law. But what the church says is that the rule of law exists by nature. And what the state's job is to recognize rights and protect us in those rights. The state doesn't confer those rights on us. The state recognizes that human beings have rights and then defends us in them. Right? Keep someone from coming and robbing my house. Keep someone from knocking this poor girl over to get a beer from her, not because we all agreed to it, but because it's wrong, because she has a right to her safety, she has a right to her beer, and I don't have a right to take it away from her, and so if I try to, then the state should stop me. The state, the church says again and again, exists to protect rights, it can't take them away. And so, very fundamentally, in this side of the column, which is a little arbitrarily got Marxist socialism, kind of historically just has that on there, is the idea that government is in charge of who has rights and who doesn't, and what those rights will be. And the important thing about saying that rights belong to man by nature is, as he says, that they are applicable to all men as such. Rights are applicable to you because you're human. not because of other secondary characteristics which others would be entitled to define at their pleasure. You're not an Aryan, so you're not human, so we're just going to shuffle you all into this camp and kill you. Right? You're not a Hutu, and so we're going to slaughter you. You are not whatever I've defined as someone who deserves rights, and so we're not going to protect you. You're not outside of the womb yet, and so we've decided your rights don't deserve to be protected. So we need to fight this idea that government confers rights, right, and can redefine them at their pleasure, and uphold the principle that the state is not the highest arbiter, right? That's what Marx was arguing for. That's why Marxist socialism is the heading there, right? That there was nothing higher than the state. There was nothing more transcendent than the decisions of the state. That's why it needed to be atheist, because it couldn't have some other higher truth or justice or goodness that it had to be obedient to. But the Christian view is that there is. I like to talk about this when I do Old Testament with David, King David, and the story of Bathsheba. Right? You know, the Jews said they wanted, or Hebrews, pardon me, said they wanted a king, and Samuel said, God, they want a king, and God said, you go tell them they don't want a king, because he's just going to lord it over them. No, they really want a king, right? So he gives them a king. And David gets a little full of himself and his kingship, and after he already saw what happened to Saul, right? And he says, I like that girl. I'm going to get her husband killed in the war, and I'm going to take her to be my own. And Nathan comes and, chastises him from God. And if you think, if the king is the highest arbiter, if this government is the highest thing, think Pharaoh. Say the Pharaoh of Egypt does what David did, and one of his, shamans comes and says, the gods say you did something wrong. What would Pharaoh say? What do you freaking do, right? I'll take your wife too if I want to. I'm the Pharaoh. There's nothing higher than me. Right? But David says, oh my gosh, and he falls on his knees and he repents and he says, you're right, I've abused my kingship. I have dishonored God, I've dishonored this woman, because as king, he understands that there's still something greater than him that he's in service of. And so we need a society that accepts, even at the, without being part of organized Judeo-Christian religion, that there is a truth and a justice that transcends, our opinions about it. That's what government is supposed to be in pursuit of, that truth. And that government works in service of that truth. It doesn't dictate or define it. So, liberal capitalism. Now, the Catholic social teaching is full of positive things to say about democracy and the free market. Not so much because they give us more freedom, although freedom is one of the four bedrock principles of Catholic social teaching. Truth, love, freedom, and justice. So the church is very big on freedom. But their endorsement of democracy and the free market is usually because they encourage participation and initiative and a sense of personal responsibility. It's a good system for engaging people in the common good and using their gifts in service of others. So we'll start with the historical critique before we get to the fundamental flaw, right? Go back to the 19th century. We have this wealth that's being generated. And because Adam Smith was spot on about how a nation needed to generate wealth. And they did. But he did not quite get distribution right. And so the wealth that was being generated wasn't being distributed in a just fashion, and it was being withheld in the hands of a few people. His theory, which actually makes much more sense if you read it, I'm being dismissive and mocking, but his theory was that self-interest would naturally distribute well. Now, unleashing personal initiative was a great thing. But self-interest does not always distribute very effectively, right? John the 23rd has this great expression that it doesn't affect distribution because of the unscrupulous strong, the powerful men and women who have no scruple, who he says rise up in every generation like cockles among the weeds. Right? They're not going to use their self-interest to give back to the common good. They're going to play the system so that they can do this, right? And so that they can hoard it all for themselves. So that's the economic side of it, which begins at Grad. But at root, the problem on this side is a flawed understanding of freedom. We, in this country, we get sort of the rejection of collectivism, most of us, right? Because we're in the land of the free, right? And so I don't want to be told what to do. I don't want to be, one of the board. I'm an individual. We get that. Somebody got my relevance. But then what happens is there's an abuse of that freedom on the liberal capitalism side of things, and we get back to this man is born free and everywhere he is in chains view of freedom. That freedom means I can do whatever I want unless there's something bigger and stronger than me stopping me. Right? That freedom means every passion, every indulgence, everything I should be able to fulfill. There's not a law against it, so I should be able to do it. That view of freedom is the flaw in our side of the system. And here is one quote among pages and pages of quotes that I could give you from John Paul II, Benedict, from the whole tradition. We hear, authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law. Right? That's what Benedict XVI was just saying in the last paragraph. And on the basis of a correct conception of the human person, it must be observed in this regard that if there is no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. As history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. In the next quote from John Paul II, reading the encyclical, Rerum Novarum, within the context of Pope Leo's whole magisterium, we see how it points essentially to the socio-economic consequences of an error, which has even greater implications. As has been mentioned, this error consists in an understanding of human freedom, which detaches it from obedience to the truth, and consequently from the duty to respect the rights of others. The essence of freedom then becomes self-love, carried to the point of contempt for God and neighbor. A self-love which leads to an unbridled affirmation of self-interest and which refuses to be limited by any demand of justice. So this false view of freedom, we are accustomed to discussing it in moral questions, right? People become promiscuous. People end their marriages for ridiculous reasons, right? People, take the escapist route of drugs or alcohol, right? And it's all, we see that all as an abuse of freedom, because freedom is given to us to pursue the good. Freedom is given to us so that we're capable of love. Because if you aren't free, you can't love. If you have no choice, it isn't love, right? Then you're just a puppet, you're just a robot. So we're given our freedom so that we can choose the good and so that we can love. And we see these moral errors as abuses of freedom. But it has huge social consequences if that is the definition of freedom that an entire society embraces. Because then I have no duty to respect the rights of others. Right? If freedom means I can do what I want, then your rights are of a secondary interest to me because they will interfere with me getting what I want. if my freedom is completely detached from truth, from something higher than me, from something transcendent, then all I have is self-love, because all I'm doing is pursuing my own will. A self-interest which refuses to be limited by any demand of justice. In Solicitudo Rei Socialis, the 1987 John Paul II one, he says the two fundamental sins that are destroying society are the thirst for power and the desire for profit at any cost. He says we have to add at any cost. Because the problem is not to desire profit, right? Profit, he says, is a healthy indicator of whether a business is doing well or not, right? But to pursue it at any cost means that you are not limited by any demand of justice. So if offering these sort of bogus home loans will make my bank a bunch of money, then I'm going to do that. Because I'm not going to be limited by some demand of justice or some concern for the other person. If I can keep my wages low so that I can get more of the profit of the company that I happen to own, I'm going to do that. Because I'm just pursuing my own self-interest, limited by no other demand. Obedient to nothing higher than myself. Which gets me to Pope Francis, which I wish I'd have put more in here. There's a little quote about something else there from Pope Francis. But everyone's kind of freaking out that Pope Francis is critiquing the free market and the capitalist system. And, you know, if you want to not be freaking out about that, read Leo the 13th and you'll go, oh, I guess I should have been freaking out for the last 150 years. It's not that new. And his point is not necessarily that a system of free exchange is a bad thing. He's not a communist, right? His point is that the free market can't be this unregulated Darwinian struggle for who's going to win, who's going to be on top. I'm just going to fight and be the fit one that survives, right? Because because we are a human family, because we want everyone to develop into the human being that God created them to be, right? And not be trampled on or stomped down. We want a just distribution of goods. God created the earth to support everybody, not just certain people. And it's our job to make sure that the goods of the earth do support everybody. It doesn't mean we all have a mathematically equal existence. That isn't justice either. But it does mean that people's basic human rights are being met, and that their development as human beings created in the image and likeness of God is being fulfilled. Right? That's our task. Not, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get all the money for myself and I don't care who I trample along the way. Right? So we have to fight this false view of freedom as I do what I please. Right? Get Pius XI again. He said, free competition, though within certain limits just and productive of good results, cannot be the ruling principle of the economic world. And that's why the Catholic Church, the social teaching of the Church is always saying that the legislature must be involved in the economy. That it should not be a completely unregulated, death match in the ring. Right? That there should be regulations. Because the unscrupulous strong will use whatever influence they have to make the game work in their favor. And then the state, which exists to protect rights and cannot take them away, must intervene to protect their rights. All right, so in closing, very briefly, you can see, probably you've noticed, that a lot of this depends upon acceptance of a transcendent truth, right, that is higher than the state, and that is higher than my own individualistic personal will. Because I'm not giving the solidarity talk, I want to close by saying that we can't just go, it's so good to know the truth, and so I must be a good person because I know that there is a truth, and so that must mean I'm going to heaven. Because Christianity isn't a philosophy. Christianity is a way of life. And it's not good enough for us to just know things. This is why I think Pope Francis is always bringing things back to the incarnation. It's amazing how often the word incarnate or incarnate or incarnation come up when he talks. He wants everything to be in flesh and blood because God was in flesh and blood. And so your Christianity can't just be in ideas and principles and fine sentiments. It has to be lived out in flesh and blood. It has to be human. It has to go into the world. He says, the last quote on my page, not to put the word into practice, not to make it reality, is to build on sand, to remain in the realm of pure ideas and to end up in a lifeless and unfruitful self-centeredness and Gnosticism. I don't want that. So you have to try to go out into the world and change it to the best of your ability. And educate yourself as much as you can on this topic, because the church has told us this is primarily the task of the laity. It is our vocation to shape the world according to the kingdom of God. You know, your priest's job is to get you to heaven. He wants to always be pointing your attention to heaven. The religious are a sign to us of the kingdom that is to come. But it's our job to take that out into the world and bring the kingdom here. And the church since Vatican II has said that again and again and again. And so I thank you for coming to this talk because it shows that you take that responsibility very seriously. Thank you very much.